Good morning, everyone. Welcome. It's good to see so many smiling faces out there after such a long period when we couldn't get together. This year, I think, has given us a real breath of fresh air in getting back together in person for events like this one. So I'm Dirk Forrester, and I'm the president and CEO of the International Missions Trading Association, and it's my pleasure to open this event, the Asia Climate Summit. I want to open by thanking so many of you that are involved in helping to sponsor this or helping to develop parts of the program with us. And I think we've got a really exciting 2 days, or for those that came yesterday for the pre-day, you know that there's been an extremely valuable set of discussions underway already, covering things like CCS and digital assets, and looking at some of the activities going on in the region. But now we're going to start the formal conference today, for today and tomorrow, to walk you through what we think is really an exciting set of developments in the Asia-Pacific region, and really take stock of some of the business trends, business opportunities, emerging ways that we can collaborate in advancing carbon market solutions. And I think it probably goes without saying to this crowd that carbon markets don't exist sort of separate from the broader climate action agenda. They're merely an enabler of ambition. They really are the way that we hopefully work together to build systems of high integrity that can deliver on net zero goals over time. IETA has sponsored quite a bit of economic research with support from some of our government partners who are in the room to look at pathways to net zero. And one of the key messages that I think has really come to the fore is nobody can get to net zero alone. Some countries have more mitigation potential than they can use or that they can afford to harvest. Other countries face very expensive alternatives. They need each other in order to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, in order to get to net zero. So I think in these halls, we're going to hear a lot about Article 6 and about the future of Article 6, because it's the part of the Paris Agreement that brings together business and governments in cooperative ways that enable us to use market-based approaches that can hopefully enable us to achieve more faster together than we would do individually. And that's true whether you're a company just operating in isolation or whether you're a country, that the pathway of working together for achieving the goals is a lot more attractive than trying to go it alone. This year we looked particularly at what will happen in the aftermath of the challenges of the war in the Ukraine. Who's going to cooperate with who? What might that look like? And the real answer to it is that those that find partners to cooperate have a much more smooth path to get to net zero and a higher likelihood of achieving it than if they opt out and don't participate. So again, the message, we all need each other in this. So I hope we're able to explore some of these concepts today. And I don't want to talk more about it right now because I don't want to steal the thunder of other sessions that are to come, but we really do have a number of exciting things to talk about. To kick us off, we are so fortunate that Grace Fu is with us from the Ministry of Sustainability and Environment here in Singapore. She's kind of a rock star for people in carbon markets because of her involvement in helping to lead Article 6 in the negotiations. And certainly, I hope Singapore is proud of the treasure that they have in Grace and her ability to sort of take command of the complex topics around Article 6, but also to do that hard work, I know, with her incredible team in helping to bring countries together on it. And so she's going to provide us some keynote remarks and really kick off this day, and then we'll move on to some others. So Grace, can I invite you up? The floor is yours. Please join me in welcoming Grace.
Thank you very much, Dirk. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and some very good friends from the climate circuit. Warm welcome to Singapore, and thank you very much for having me at the Asia Climate Summit. And this summit is held shortly after COP27, and in fact, our pavilion was practically next to IETA's, and we certainly benefited from the cross-fertilization of ideas from our respective panel discussions. I think we are trying to out-talk one another and be louder than another at some point in time. But it was a very fruitful track of COP27. I think we have all benefited from the people that's just coming through our pavilions. And many people have asked about my thoughts on COP27. And the meeting in Egypt was held under very challenging circumstances as countries grappled with difficult economic and geopolitical developments. Nonetheless, COP27 affirmed parties' support for multilateralism in addressing climate change. Despite differences and difficulties, countries came together and made progress on several issues. For instance, the US and China resumed their formal dialogue on climate action, and Russia-Ukraine war did not derail the meeting. An agreement was reached to include loss and damage as an agenda of the meeting and to set up a fund for vulnerable countries hit hard by climate disasters. Although the details of the fund will have to be discussed later, the recognition of the impact of climate change on vulnerable countries is an important step. We must continue to step up the pace of climate action. The latest United Nations Environment Programme Emissions Gap report shows that the world's carbon emissions targets remain short of the Paris Agreement temperature goal. The report points out that incremental efforts are no longer feasible and calls for systemic global transformations in key sectors such as energy supply, industry, buildings, transport, food systems, and the financial system. In our drive towards a net zero world, we urgently require further international cooperation on low-carbon technologies and carbon markets, including working together under Article 6 of Paris Agreement. And that leads me to speak about today's theme, which is carbon markets for net zero, an era of growth, convergence, innovation, and opportunity. And let me share some of my thoughts on each of these four themes. First, on the theme of growth. Since my personal involvement in Article 6, which is, as Dirk has mentioned, rather complex topic of discussion, I have really witnessed a really huge increase in interest on the carbon markets. I think that a lot of momentum, we're just sharing our views earlier on, a lot of momentum has come from the financial market and also on the corporate markets. And it is beneficial for countries like Singapore because, as Dirk has described, we are one of those countries that have very limited renewable energy options, and therefore in our net zero pathway, we will look at carbon credits really as one of the options. It's not the only option. We are definitely working very hard on other pathways. We're looking at green hydrogen, we're looking at CCUS, but these technologies are still a bit away from commercial viability. So in the meantime, looking at the viable and vibrant growing carbon credit market is something that will be beneficial to Singapore in many ways, both as a financial hub for Asia, but also for us as a country in decarbonization. And this growth in carbon markets, or at least interest in the carbon markets, is driven by growing climate ambitions in countries and companies worldwide. Today, around 140 countries have either proposed or declared net zero targets, and this covers 91% of global emissions, up from 70% in May 2021, about a year ago. Over 1/3 of the world's largest publicly traded companies have set net zero goals. Singapore has raised our carbon ambition. We strengthened our long-term emissions development strategy, LEDS, with a clear goal to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. We made legislative changes to raise our carbon tax fivefold, from $5 per ton currently to $25 per ton in 2024 and 2025, with a view to reach between 50 to 80% per ton by 2030. And this is really on all greenhouse gas emission. If you add on the kind of tax that we have on diesel, which cover our transport sector, we're talking about our cover of 90%. So this is from first ton, and it's comprehensive, it's flat, and therefore I think it is an effective policy lever to cause industries to adopt decarbonization technology or investments. We also put in place a policy framework to allow carbon tax liable facilities to use high-quality international carbon credits to offset up to 5% of taxable emissions from 2024. So government, instead of collecting the carbon tax, is prepared to put 5% of that into carbon credits. So we are really racing against time to develop that framework for international carbon credits of high quality to be used for offsetting carbon tax liability to the government. Such policies, as well as the further progress on Article 6 rules, are important prerequisites to grow the carbon markets. At Sharm el-Sheikh, Singapore signed memorandums of understanding on carbon market cooperation with Peru and Papua New Guinea, in addition to similar partnerships with Ghana, Morocco, Colombia, Indonesia, and Vietnam. Carbon markets enable much needed finance to be channeled to support emissions reduction or removal projects worldwide. They also enable countries such as Singapore, which are alternative energy constrained, to access other viable decarbonization pathways to reach net zero, while contributing meaningfully to climate finance and delivering sustainable development benefits worldwide. The next theme, convergence. While the growth in carbon markets has been encouraging, it has led to the proliferation of many new standards. Convergence in standards is needed. There is lack of consensus on what high-integrity carbon markets look like. One reason is because carbon markets and how they advance net zero are not intuitive concepts. There remains limited awareness on how carbon credits are generated, verified, traded, and used. And there are competing interpretations on environmental integrity principles, such as permanence and additionality. Singapore supports the harmonization of guidance, rules, and market infrastructure. We participate actively in various platforms and bodies, including the UNFCCC Article 6 Supervisory Body, the CORSIA Technical Advisory Board, and the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. We also worked with IETA and the World Bank on the Climate Action Data Trust, which will be launched later today. This decentralized metadata infrastructure would help address double counting, foster transparency, and raise confidence in carbon markets. My third point on innovation. Innovations in carbon services can accelerate the development of high-quality carbon projects. Project developers will benefit from more options in assessing carbon sequestration potential and of different ecosystems and project types. This helps unlock the potential in Southeast Asia, which hosts 1/3 of the world's mangroves and nearly 15% of the tropical forests, whose biodiversity holds an annual economic value of more than $2 trillion. Research institutes can play a role here. For example, the National University of Singapore Centre for Nature-Based Climate Solutions has launched the Carbon Integrity SG Research Program, which develops methodologies tailored to Southeast Asia's habitat, while its Carbon Prospecting Dashboard, a free-to-use platform, identifies forests and mangroves that require greater protection. I've seen the dashboard at work in Sharm el-Sheikh. It's very, very interesting, very informative, and I urge all of you, when you have some time, to just go on to the platform and have a look. Methodologies developed for novel project types, such as jatropha plants, also enable more high-quality carbon credits to be generated. For example, Singapore-based J-Oil became the world's first corporate to secure gold standard certification for its jatropha plantation on marginal land in Ghana. This certification enables J-Oil to generate high-quality carbon credits from high-yielding, climate-resilient strain of jatropha fruits, which are a low-carbon source material for biofuel. Innovations in science and technology can also help in the monitoring, reporting, and verification from the inception of a transaction through its project life cycle. Satellite monitoring and geographical information systems can survey natural ecosystems to determine permanence and leakage. Innovations adapted from the finance industry will help carbon exchange platforms to process transactions with speed, security, and integrity. Growth, convergence, and innovation create new opportunities in the carbon markets, and it's really the fourth pillar. The global net zero transition will see growing demand for carbon services and carbon credits. To realize these opportunities, we need to build capacity here and abroad. Domestically, the carbon services ecosystem is vibrant and growing. Just looking at this room and the number of participants here, it tells you where this movement is going. We have 70 organizations engaged in carbon services and trading activities. They provide a whole range of services, from sustainability advisory and consulting, carbon project development, to financing, trading, and governance. We supported the growth of 13 such firms last year. Universities, professional bodies, trade associations are partnering knowledge partners supported by government agencies such as Enterprise Singapore to raise the level of competencies in sustainability. We're also supporting capability building in the region. Singapore and New Zealand conducted a joint capacity building workshop on Article 6 cooperation for ASEAN member states in September. In October, we launched the Sustainability Action Package, or SAP. The SAP welcomes multi-sectoral knowledge partners to share their expertise with foreign officials, including on carbon markets. This is a program that's run by our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, regularly invites participants from fellow developing countries on a whole range of issues. And the Sustainability Action Package is one such package that places focus on sustainability, including climate action. So we hope that by bringing officials here, by exchanging the latest with each other, we're able to raise the overall level of competencies and understanding of many of these climate-related issues, including carbon credits. At COP27, we joined Japan's Article 6 implementation partnership to contribute to capability building together with like-minded partners. These efforts could collectively increase the supply of high-quality credits and demand for related services. So in conclusion, confronted with today's climate emergency, we need to realize growth in climate ambition, common standards, and innovations across and beyond the carbon markets ecosystem. We call upon everyone to embrace the window of opportunity to shape carbon markets that deliver genuine abatement and a greener future for all. And I wish everybody a very productive summit. Thank you very much.
That was really terrific, Minister. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and help kick us off with such inspirational words. And also, it really is impressive to learn about the full array of activities that the government of Singapore is involved in to really, I think, breathe life into these maybe esoteric and complicated policy ideas, but they really are essential to enabling us as a broader community to get to our net zero goals. For the program today, we at IETA have benefited tremendously from collaboration on the program with the International Energy Agency and with the International Climate Action Partnership. And what I want to do now is make space for a quick video message from leaders from both of those. And we're going to start with Mary Burst-Warlick, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. She couldn't be here in person, so she's sent a brief video. So we'll tee up that video now and hear from Mary.
Ladies and gentlemen, greetings from the International Energy Agency in Paris. I'm really delighted to be part of the opening of the Asia Climate Summit organized by our partners, the International Emissions Trading Association, with whom we have jointly organized an annual GHG emissions trading workshop for the past 22 years. I would also like to thank Minister Fu for her opening remarks. Singapore has been a really valued member of the IEA family since 2016, and is one of the agency's closest partners in Southeast Asia and beyond. For many years now, Singapore has been instrumental in the IEA's excellent relationship with ASEAN, driving capacity building across Southeast Asian countries through our joint regional training hub, which is now in its 7th year. I'd like to begin by focusing on the fact that the world is currently facing its first truly global energy crisis, a shock of unprecedented breadth and complexity, with impacts that will be felt for years to come. Pressures in markets predated Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but Russia's actions have had far-reaching impacts on the global energy system, disrupting supply and demand patterns and fracturing long-standing trading relationships. This crisis is affecting all countries, but we are particularly concerned about the effect it is having on the people who can least afford it. In some quarters, there is a mistaken idea that we are in the midst of a clean energy crisis. This is simply not true. The world is struggling with too little clean energy, not too much. Faster clean energy transitions would have helped to moderate the impact of this current crisis, and they represent the best way out of it. Another mistaken idea is that today's crisis is a huge setback for efforts to tackle climate change and put the planet on a sustainable net zero pathway. Our analysis, however, demonstrates that we may be at a historic turning point towards a cleaner and more secure energy system, thanks to the unprecedented response from governments all around the world. Measures such as Japan's Green Transformation Program, Korea's goal to increase the share of nuclear and renewables in its energy mix, and ambitious clean energy targets in China and India. The momentum behind change in the energy sector is coming not just from economic factors and climate commitments, but because policymakers around the world are reassessing their priorities and taking steps to address their energy security vulnerabilities. It is very much worth bearing in mind that the technologies needed to achieve the necessary deep cuts in global emissions by 2030 already exist, and the policies that can drive their deployment are already proven. Effective carbon pricing helps by ensuring appropriate price signals. And the current situation in energy markets underscores the huge challenges of reducing emissions while maintaining energy security. Now, renewable energy options such as solar and wind are the most cost-effective new sources of electricity generation in most markets. But despite their impressively rapid growth in recent years, much more effort is needed to scale up clean energy investments and deployments of the technologies that will help to drive down emissions. The environmental case for clean energy needs no reinforcement, but the economic arguments in favor of cost-competitive and affordable clean technologies are stronger today, as is the case for energy security. But what does this mean for Asia, a continent that has developed rapidly over the past few decades? It is now a major engine of global economic and energy demand growth, but with strong country-by-country variations. Growth in energy demand in China has been a major driver for all manner of energy trends over the past 2 decades, and IEA scenario modeling projects that energy demand in China will stall by 2030, with emissions peaking around the same time. India becomes the world's most populous country by 2025, and when combined with the twin forces of urbanization and industrialization, these factors will drive rapid growth in energy demand. With estimated energy demand growth of more than 3% projected from now to 2030, renewables will meet nearly 2/3 of India's rapidly rising demand for electricity. Southeast Asia is also projected to see a rapid rise in energy demand, with annual average growth of more than 3% from 2021 to 2030, met by increases in all fuels and technologies. The energy prospects for the entire region have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, new energy and climate policy commitments, and, most recently, high and volatile prices exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine. IEA's Southeast Asia Energy Outlook 2022, which was released in May, highlights that well-managed energy transitions will shield Southeast Asia from the impacts of volatile international markets, but it also warns that energy security during transitions will not come for free. The region must attract much higher levels of energy sector investment to accelerate its clean energy transition and to meet rising demand for energy services. We also have the Paris Agreement, a much stronger international consensus on climate change, and a framework to act. Many countries in Asia have updated their NDCs with enhanced targets or increased scope since COP26, including Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, India, South Korea, and most recently Vietnam. More recently at COP27, we heard the announcement to establish and operationalize a loss and damage fund, particularly for nations most vulnerable to the climate crisis. Of course, commitments and pledges are not enough on their own. Implementation is key. But the Paris Agreement provides important guide rails for the future as we move to a net zero energy system. Carbon pricing will also be an important instrument to implement climate commitments. The discussions in the next 3 days here at the Asia Climate Summit will be very useful and particularly timely in this pivotal year. More and more countries are adapting carbon pricing as an effective instrument to support decarbonization of their economies. Domestic emissions trading systems globally have increased in scope and allowance price in the last year. International carbon markets have also experienced revived interest following agreement on the Article 6 rulebook at COP26, despite a slowdown in the operationalization from the outcomes of COP27. Voluntary carbon markets also experienced a fast growth to meet the increased demand from corporate net zero commitments. And global issuance of carbon credits in 2021 was around 480 million tons of CO2 equivalent, with a market valuation that exceeded $1 billion for the first time. The IEA has always seen carbon pricing as an effective complementary policy in the arsenal of instruments that governments, regulators, companies, and other sub-jurisdictions can use to decarbonize their economic sectors and activities alongside other low-carbon sector-specific policies. The IEA has in fact been working on carbon pricing for over 20 years, not just with our membership, but with countries such as Brazil, China, Indonesia, Thailand, and South Africa, to share and provide lessons on the design and implementation of carbon pricing in the power sector. We are also engaged in Article 6 negotiations, providing technical inputs to negotiations through the OECD IEA Climate Change Expert Group. So in conclusion, let me say the IEA is really delighted to have the opportunity to participate in the Asia Climate Summit. Your collective commitment to continue discussing these important matters remains essential in these challenging times. I wish you fruitful discussions in the 3 days ahead. Thank you.
Great. And some of our IEA colleagues are with us throughout this event, so you'll get to see other parts of the talented team there in other parts of the program. We have one more brief welcome address from Rajendra Sahota, who is a longtime friend of IETA from her leadership of the California carbon market. So she's with the California Air Resources Board. She's also, that's her day job, and she also serves as the chair of the board of ICAP. So let's bring up Rajendra's welcome remarks, and then we'll have one more short speech and end this segment.
Hello, and on behalf of ICAP, it's an honor to welcome you all to the Asia Pacific Climate Summit of 2022. I am Rajendra Sahota, co-chair of the ICAP and Deputy Executive Officer of Climate Change and Research at the California Air Resources Board, the lead agency for climate mitigation in the state of California. I regret that I cannot be there with you, but I'm very glad to see this event come together after a 2-year break brought on by the pandemic. The Asia Pacific Climate Summit is an important forum for advancing policies to address climate change, which we all know are critical. The science absolutely makes clear our collective need to reach net zero emissions as quickly as possible, and so do our own lived experiences. Here in California, we've had to wear an N95 mask well before the pandemic, not because of any virus, but because of the unprecedented wildfires our state has experienced in recent history, and the smoke those fires have spread across communities, cities, and at times entire stretches of North America. We know that record-breaking drought, storms, flooding, and rising seas have also reached Asia and the Pacific as well. Climate change is here, but thankfully, we can still do something about it. And thanks to convenings like these, we can find ways to learn from one another and multiply the effects of our individual actions. In fact, we are already building on growing decarbonization and zero efforts around the world here at home in California. In California, we are closing out a big year in climate policy. We dedicated $54 billion for climate mitigation in our last budget, an unprecedented investment in clean technology, infrastructure, and projects in communities that suffer most from other harmful pollution. We also codified our statewide target to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045 or sooner, and have finalized our 2022 scoping plan to achieve it. Our scoping plan brings together a suite of programs for incentives, regulations, and importantly, carbon pricing that will work together over the next 2 decades to zero out emissions across the state. As many governments face several deep challenges at once, the effects of climate change, conflict, and economic uncertainty, I want to highlight one particular piece of California's climate experience. Our cap and trade program, which has been in operation for over a decade, is a critical piece of our climate portfolio. As we launched our program, many said it would crash our economy, but we have seen just the opposite. We've seen California's economy grow and continue to grow, becoming the 5th largest in the world, poised to become the 4th largest. At the same time, we've seen our emissions drop such that we achieved our 2020 target years ahead of schedule. Our cap and trade program has provided a long-term signal that clean technology investments will pay off in California. It has also generated billions in revenue to invest in targeted climate programs and the communities most burdened by traditional air pollution. So in closing, in California, we have benefited immensely from the kinds of exchanges that are just ahead of you all at the summit. As we and other jurisdictions look at carbon neutrality goals, we are facing many important questions about how to design and adapt climate policies and emission trading systems to meet them, whether it's amending existing programs or launching new programs. I'm glad that you all will have the chance to engage on these and other topics over the next few days, and I look forward to the next opportunity to join you in these discussions. Thank you, and wishing you a safe and peaceful and healthy holiday season. Bye.
So next year we'll make sure Rajendra comes in person, but it's great to see her on the screen offering a welcome, and I hope everybody gets a chance to interact with ICAP team here, Stefano De Clara and his colleagues who have also been instrumental in developing this program. Now I want to invite up Ambassador Frank Gruder from the Swiss Embassy here in Singapore. Some of you may have forgotten that IETA is Swiss, but technically we're Swiss. So Frank, please come up and give us some welcome remarks. Really, I think all of you, all the carbon market pioneers in Article 6 know the incredible work that Switzerland is doing to kind of blaze trails for all of us to follow. So Frank, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dirk, dear Minister, Grace Fu, dear Deputy Minister, ladies and gentlemen. Why should we care about future generations? What have they ever done for us? This saying by American comedian Groucho Marx comes to mind when we look at some of the discussions that have taken place at COP27. And many participants, including the Swiss head of delegation, returned from Sharm el-Sheikh a bit sobered, as it became clear that achieving the 1.5-degree goal would, as it stands now, be increasingly difficult. We, of course, can now put our hands in our lap and complain about the state of the world and the crisis of multilateralism, but this is a luxury we do not have. We know that every 0.1 degree of global warming that we can avoid will make a huge difference. And if we want to effectively address climate change, we must, 1, reduce CO2-intensive activities, 2, introduce clean technologies across the board, mitigate the negative effects of climate change, and support climate adaptation. And fourthly, we have to use market instruments to set the right incentives and engage all stakeholders, governments, the private sector, civil society, and citizens alike. IETA is doing exactly this, engaging companies and governments with a view to implementing smart carbon trading solutions. And CO2 emissions must have a significant price if we really want to incentivize a transition towards net zero. Setting up a carbon trading market needs collaboration also between states, and therefore, as a Swiss ambassador to Singapore, I very much welcome that Geneva-based IETA is going to open up an office in Singapore. The more bridges we have between Singapore and Switzerland, the merrier I am as an ambassador. And building bridges is also what Switzerland tries to do in its foreign and economic policy. To cite one example, every October we organize, the Swiss government, the Conference on Sustainable Finance in Geneva, which is called Building Bridges. And this is a conference that brings together governments, companies, the international organizations, the civil society to define collaborative projects to make the world more sustainable. Ladies and gentlemen, I congratulate the government of Singapore, IETA, and the World Bank on setting up a climate action data trust. It is such measures that help to exploit the full potential of carbon markets in the future. And I thank IETA and the government of Singapore for having invited me today. It was an honor to speak to you, and I wish you fruitful discussions and valuable contacts here at the Asia Climate Summit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Again, it's a delight to have colleagues like Ambassador Gruder to work with and to support us as we're expanding our activities in this region, and great to have the support from back home. This ends the first segment of this morning. We're just kind of a very short break while I bring up the panelists for the next segment. So my advice is to stay where you are unless you really need a bio break. So with that, we'll just pause for a moment and bring up the next group of speakers, and we'll be ready to roll. Join me in thanking all of our speakers this morning, but especially Grace and Frank. Okay. Everyone, if you could take a seat. There's a whole row on the front row that says reserved, but I'm going to open it up for you nice people. So if anybody would like a good seat, come on down front and join us. Great. So this is our Asia Carbon Market Roundup session. And to sort of kick us off, here's how this is going to work. I'm your moderator, for better or worse. But what we're going to do is start off with Stefano De Clara from ICAP giving us a bit of a survey of state of play across the region. And then we've got a set of experts here that I'm going to call on to give observations on it. And hopefully we'll have enough time for some engagement with you in the audience, okay? So for some Q&A, but you're going to have to be polite or I won't call on you again. So with that, I want to invite Stefano up to kick it off and do the overview. So Stefano, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dirk, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all. So as Dirk mentioned, I'll be giving you a quick overview of where we are today with the implementation of emission trading systems and more broadly market instruments in the Asia-Pacific region. For those of you that don't know ICAP, we are a partnership of 40 different governments that work on the implementation of carbon markets as a way to reduce CO2 emissions. Singapore is actually the latest addition to our family as he joined ICAP earlier this year. And it's a pleasure to be here for the Asia-Pacific, for the Asia Climate Summit. So first of all, I wanted to start by highlighting that emission trading systems are a key tool to reach net zero commitments. 1/3 of the emissions covered by net zero commitments in law are actually regulated under an emission trading system. A significant amount of emissions under commitments that are being advanced through legislation are also covered by emission trading systems. And going forward, we can expect this percentage to increase as countries implement tools to underpin and to meet those net zero commitments. And this is where we are as of today in terms of implementation of emission trading systems around the world. Some of these systems have been around for almost 20 years now. Some of them came online more recently. Some are scheduled to start on January 1st of next year. And many more are either under development or under considerations in different parts of the world. And we'll have a closer look at the Asia-Pacific region a bit further down in the presentation. Something that I wanted to highlight is that there are also no two identical emission trading systems out there, and every single country that is implementing one has developed it according to its need and its national circumstances. As a result, systems can cover different sectors. Most systems tend to cover the power and industry sectors because those are where most of the emissions are, but some systems also got expanded to cover additional sectors over time. New Zealand is a prime example in the region of how an emission trading system can cover a significant part of the economy. As a result of different configurations and different design options, emission trading systems also generate different carbon prices, and these prices also evolve over time as a result of market dynamics. In the bottom graph, you can see how prices around the world evolved over the last 15 years or so. And something worth noting in the top graph is also how prices have evolved over the last few months since the beginning of the year. What is worth noting is that, as we all know, we are in a context of a significant and global energy crisis. But even though emission trading systems were confronted with unprecedented challenges, all systems proved to be resilient to external shocks, and prices have kept stable throughout the energy crisis so far. Also in the context of the energy crisis, one thing worth keeping in mind is that emission trading systems do generate a significant amount of revenues. Since they started to generate revenue, so since 2008, a grand total of more than $160 billion were raised. What is also worth noting is that as a result of increased prices and increased auctioning in recent year, a third of the total amount was raised last year alone. So that is around 50 billion of US dollars globally. And this is important because revenues can be used by governments to further climate action, but also to protect exposed consumers or industries from unintended effects of higher energy prices, for example. Now, if we look a bit more closer at the region, we see that there's already a great deal of action on emission trading systems in the Asia-Pacific region, with systems being in operation from all the way back from 2009. More systems came online more recently, and many more are also scheduled to start operating or piloting in the coming years. And if we also broaden the look to countries that are in the process of considering what carbon pricing instrument to implement, we see that we can expect more systems to become under development and eventually under implementation in the near future. We talked about already about regional cooperation in the region. It's worth keeping in mind that emission trading systems are a domestic instrument in nature, but they also offer options for regional or international cooperation. A key feature is obviously linking of the different emission trading systems. Another tool through which emission trading systems can extend the reach of carbon pricing beyond their borders is through the use of either domestic or international carbon credits. And all of this obviously can happen under the context of Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is a broad framework for international market-based cooperation that can allow for ETS linking, can allow for sourcing of international credits, and can also allow for different forms of government-to-government cooperation that can obviously be a way also to involve the private sector in bilateral transactions on international markets. And I wanted to end my presentation with a bit of a reflection on what we might expect in the region in terms of international carbon markets developments. We saw that in recent years, and especially out of COP26 and COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, there were a great deal of announcements from countries in the region on international market-based cooperation. Japan has been working for many years on building a network of governments under the joint crediting mechanism that will help Japan meet its NDC through the transfer of international credits. Australia has taken steps more recently to go down a similar path. New Zealand has been really active for a number of years on international markets and has been looking at Article 6 really closely. Singapore, as it was noted in the remarks, has signed a number of bilateral deals at COP27. China also has signaled its interest for the first time in using international markets, and more developments can be expected in the coming years. I also wanted to show you a quick graph from Carbon Pulse, actually, that highlights the international and bilateral deals through Article 6 that were signaled to date, and most of them do involve countries from the Asia-Pacific region, either on, both on the selling side, but also on the buying side. And if you follow those lines, you can see that there are countries in the region that will sell to countries in the region. There are also countries in the region that will sell to international buyers elsewhere. But there are also countries in the region that will be on the buying side and will buy from countries in different regions. So the Asia-Pacific region is really at the core of a nascent market under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And just to sum things up, I think, again, if we look at what might happen in the next few years, we can expect emission trading systems and different forms of carbon pricing to further expand and consolidate in the region. But also an interesting space to watch will be around international cooperation between countries in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. And with that, I'll hand it back to Dirk, and I'm looking forward to the discussion with the fellow panelists. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Stefano. There's a lot in that that you covered quickly, but fortunately we have some folks here who can help amplify some of the points, but maybe bring some additional perspective sort of from the ground in some key jurisdictions. And Dita, I'm going to start with you, Dita Gardera, who is joining us from the Ministry of Economic Affairs in Indonesia. There's a lot of interest in this room in Indonesia, as you might expect, in what the prospects are there for carbon markets, what the government's intention is. Can you bring us up to date and give us just a little flavor of what you see as the current scenario and the outlook on Indonesia?
Yeah, thank you, Dirk. Yeah, Indonesia realized that we cannot fulfill our commitment to achieve NDC by government budget. So that's why we see that the carbon market is one of the best option to support all stakeholders, particularly government, to achieve the NDC. So we exercising almost all option of carbon pricing. Yeah. Yeah, I saw your pictures, Stefano. Indonesia is still under consideration, but no, we have already the regulation from the law up to the operational regulation, ministerial decree, and and we will implement the cap and trade and tax hopefully next year. Right now we are preparing all the modalities. Institutional building, something like that. And also we are very committed that we already enhanced our NDC from 29% emission reduction by 2030, move to 32%. Also, we exercising Article 6, one of them with ADB, with VK, and also particularly in land sector, we have 4 ongoing program, RED Plus through RBP with Norway, FCPF and BioCF with World Bank, and also GCF. So yeah, hopefully all the measures could be implemented by next year. Thank you.
Great, and we'll probably loop back to you further in the discussion, but that's a great kind of a scene setter update from to start us off. So thanks for that, Dita. Benedict, I'm going to come to you next, and first of all, thank you for letting us borrow Minister Fu this morning. That was amazing to have those opening sort of framing remarks. But again, I think the audience would love to hear a bit of the vision from Singapore right now on how you're planning to build out your cooperation program, what it means for the domestic market, but also interesting to see Singapore listed there as sort of a, I don't know, I took it as a pretty prominent player on from Stefano's slide on Article 6 cooperation. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yep. Thanks so much, Dirk, for the question and for bringing the Asia Climate Summit here, as well as for setting up an IETA office in Singapore. And I think we are happy to work with IETA to see how we can build on this office that's being set up and all our various collaborations that we are doing, how we can extend it beyond Singapore to the region and to the globe itself. So to your question specifically, we see Article 6 as a means and a framework to get countries to cooperate together and to cooperate together to generate mutually beneficial outcomes. And that's really the essence of Article 6. It's about collaborative approaches, cooperative approaches amongst different countries around the world to advance climate action. Through all our discussions with numerous countries that are keen on this cooperation, we see cooperation generating benefits on three key fronts itself. One is clearly on abatement. So Article 6, I think, allows us to channel our efforts, our expertise, our financial resources, as well as our technical know-how to unlock mitigation potential that would not have occurred otherwise. And that is really one of the key elements of various projects that we try to do around the world. We look for projects that would have not occurred, that would have not been able to materialize without an Article 6 framework and implementation underpinning it itself. So this is something that we do together with Indonesia. We signed an MOU with Indonesia earlier this year. We have been in discussions on potential Article 6 projects, as well as more than 20, 30 different countries around the world whom we are having such discussions. And I think that's one of our key underpinning factors, because I think for those of you who will be aware, Article 6 entails corresponding adjustments. And if you don't unlock new abatement that would not have occurred otherwise, and if you do corresponding adjustments in the absence of it, then that would not bring about a mutually beneficial outcome. The country would then need to think about how am I going to meet my NDC after doing the corresponding adjustments. So that's one pillar. The second pillar is on sustainable development benefits. So whatever we do, we want the local community within the country to benefit itself. We try to maximize the sustainable development benefits, maximize the co-benefits as far as possible. And this can take different forms and shapes. So one key form is that as far as possible, we try to involve local participants, local companies in the implementation of the project. The other thing which we try to do is that although it's only highly encouraged for Article 6, we are going ahead with it, and that's the share of proceeds. So we are, for all our collaborations, we have said to all countries that share of proceeds, we're prepared to do 5% share of proceeds, which is not mandatory under 6.2, it's mandatory under 6.4. And for the 5%, it's direct to the country itself to develop adaptation projects that it would actually find beneficial. So that's an example of how we try to maximize the sustainable development benefits. And then the last key pillar is the investment flows, the investment outcomes. I think markets in general, it's about making something that's not economically viable. And when you do that, actually you crowd in additional investments into the host country itself. And depending on which sector, which project that you're talking about, these crowding in effect can be multiples of the initial carbon credit revenue that is being injected into the country, into the sector. So that's really our vision, a mutually beneficial outcome across all these three fronts itself. And I think we hope to demonstrate that this is achievable, to show and indicate what are some of the concrete outcomes that we are able to achieve through our numerous collaborations with different countries around the world. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben. And I think that's it's really fruitful for the audience to kind of get a sense of what the game plan is for Singapore. Obviously, a large part of this room is based here, and so I know you'll have a lot of allies in the private sector here in helping to realize that vision. As part of that, Wei Mei, whom I'm going to come to you next. Wei Mei is with Air Carbon Exchange, and so we got a couple of private sector viewpoints here. And Wei Mei, I'm curious, as you see sort of what Stefano described there about activity across the region, I know you have regional responsibilities for Air Carbon. Tell us what you're seeing.
Thank you so much for inviting me here today. I'm really glad to be on the same panel as Benedict. I mean, we used to work at NCCS together. So I'm head of APAC at Air Carbon Exchange, and on this panel, I'm supposed to bring the exchange perspective. I think in the past 2 years, we've seen some interesting vacillation between trading spot carbon via standardized contracts versus trading on a per project basis. So it's easy to forget that actually standardized contracts for voluntary carbon credits have only existed for around 2 years. And there was an interesting willingness to trade based on standardized contracts across the various exchanges. And if you want to know which exchanges trade them, you need only to look as far as the list of sponsors, actually. So apart from that, this year has been, after Ukraine in February, people have been trading more on a per project basis, and there's been a sort of like a back and forth oscillation between the two kinds or two ways of trading carbon. And this year, because there's been more emphasis on project-based trading or bilateral trades or OTC trades, there's a lot more focus on individual projects. Projects in Indonesia, for example, they've been pressed for a little bit. And because of this focus, we have also seen that well, there's always sort of a pushback eventually that comes in when the pendulum swings to one end. There has been a bit of uncertainty as well, which is keeping some traders on the sidelines because they're trading on a per project basis. As they acquire carbon credits on a per project basis, there's always this fear of being accused of greenwashing. And amongst the clients, we've been hearing a lot more of these concerns, particularly because I think last year there were some articles that were put up by certain journalists, which have been debunked. They related to some of the projects in the region, actually. They've been debunked roundly by Vera as well as the project developers, but it's sort of stuck in the minds of a lot of clients. So that's something that we've seen happen on the markets, and that's keeping some of the trading activity a little bit lower this year. Having said that, I think factors like this are actually going to drive a lot of innovation in the market. So over the past 2 years, you've seen the innovation of standardized contracts. The CORSIA standard, of course, is very popular, and again, it started gaining momentum again. But I think you'll also see innovation in other kinds of products which will be tradable on the market, stuff like the Global Emission Reduction Instrument. It's basically an ETF backed by carbon credits, and it has an interesting characteristic that it gives you a path to net zero, is tradable, and actually may help you with the greenwashing claims. So I think the trends that we see in the region and globally are that you see a lot more innovation and a lot more interesting new products designed to help the market manage its uncertainties and its concerns. And the last point I'll probably touch on is in the past, we've seen and talked a lot about the voluntary versus the compliance markets. It's an easy way to introduce these concepts to a lot of the clients and traders out there. But I think in the coming months, or perhaps even in the coming years, what we are thinking and seeing at the exchange is that we are likely to see a slightly more tiered market when it comes to the carbon market. So we have domestic ETSs. We may have carbon clubs, which are led by governments and through bilateral arrangements or multilateral arrangements. And then we may see the VCM that actually picks up on what is not covered by the NDCs. I mean, so we're quite far away from 1.5 degree world, and some of that slack might need to be picked up by the voluntary carbon markets. Having said that, even though there's a lot of developments between governments, I mean, all the different MOUs signed between Japan or between Singapore and the other countries, something that might be of slight concern is also that there's a tendency of countries to bring carbon behind the borders. By that, we mean that the seller countries have a tendency to want to ensure that their NDCs are settled first before releasing carbon credits into the international markets. Those may have corresponding adjustments associated with them. And then for the buyer countries, while they may be collaborating, often within those mechanisms, and they're there today already in certain ETSs and mechanisms, what they do is they tend to bring the carbon credits from the international markets, could be from a CDM registry, a Vera registry, so on, a retirement, and then a reissuance within the domestic scheme. So that's what we mean by we see carbon being brought behind borders, and that may have some implications for international tradability and liquidity of these markets. So we're watching that closely.
Thanks, Hui Mei. That's really interesting, and again, we may loop back to that and further in the discussion. But I want to bring in Hendrik Rosenthal. He's one of the out-of-towners here from Hong Kong with CLP Group. Hendrik really is a company that has assets in a number of the countries that Hui Mei was talking about. Interested in sort of what your vantage point is right now on sort of the current state of the markets and also on where you see some of the opportunities and outlook on it.
Sure. No, thanks. Thanks very much for having CLP join the discussion this morning as well. Just by context, we are an electric utility. We have our home base in Hong Kong, where we've been operating for over 120 years, but we've, over the years, invested significantly in Australia, India, and particularly mainland China as being our key focus, with a mixed portfolio of assets, including coal, gas, nuclear, and renewables. But in this context, in terms of what we see for China in particular, if I can zoom in on that one, there's been quite a bit of discussion internally for us of how do we actually create additional value from our renewable assets in particular via carbon credits or certificates, green energy certificates. And it's a bit of a murky situation, really. There's a lot of legacy issues we have to deal with in terms of CCRs, so the old carbon credits that are available still, and then going forward, how do we see this regulatory environment change? The biggest sort of driver for us, and the business literally came for a discussion of how do we deal with this, is there is a lot of demand for green or zero carbon electricity. And ultimately, that's what we want to generate. That's what we want to bring to the market. And it's a question of how do we practically make that happen within that regulatory environment where PPAs or green PPAs were not necessarily a tool that we could rely on. So providing electricity directly via a PPA was not necessarily an option. Do we offer them carbon credits or do we offer them green energy certificates was the fundamental question. And it's come to the point now where we really see some changes that have come through also very, very recently that have removed issues around double counting. So oftentimes the generator can claim for the renewable portfolio standard that they have met or deployed certain amounts of renewable or zero carbon electricity, while then also the off-taker can claim at the same time. Obviously not really good from an integrity perspective. But for us, it was then a question of, well, the way it's looking now is we directly sell into the grid with grid parity pricing. And we can increasingly in some jurisdiction go down the pathway of offering a green PPA or a renewable energy certificate, really being the tool. So this is obviously outside the scheme of the emission, the ETS, the China ETS. But that's how we meet that demand from the corporate side in particular and large off-takers. And that is increasingly the route we would prefer to go and also where we would see the most upside in terms of actually creating value and incentivizing us to build renewables quicker. The challenge, I think, then becomes from a China ETS perspective, where we still operate coal. And for that, the type of plants we have, we don't actually see a lot of pressure given the allocation we have and also the pricing point that's currently there. For us, the biggest challenge for this year was the energy crisis for running coal plants in China and the escalating price of coal, really making it uneconomical. So, you know, that worked. Let's continue maybe on that path if you're looking really to drive down the use of coal. But in terms of utilizing carbon credits to also meet your allocation, you can go up to 5%. And currently, we really only have CCERs. Those are legacy CDM type credits that we can rely upon. If you now take the view of, well, all the renewable assets that are being deployed within China will go to the green energy certificate route, not the carbon credit route, what's going to be the supply to meet that 5%? And I think this is where it's particularly interesting, also coming back to your point of what was alluded to at COP27 from the China delegation, well, perhaps there will be interlinkages to the global market to supply credits into the China market. For initially, obviously, the ETS only covers the electric utility sector, but there is a lot of pilots still happening to expand it to other sectors to meet that demand. So I think there's a lot more coming in this space. But renewables, I think it's quite specific in terms of how that's being handled now, and that provides some clarity for us, in particular of how we go forward with our investments in that space.
Thanks, Hendrik, and thanks for bringing us that little insight on where the sort of CCER market is right now and sort of what the potential is. I think I was at the China Pavilion in Sharm el-Sheikh when that trial balloon was floated, and I almost wondered if I was hearing it right. And so I actually, from one of your former colleagues, got a picture of the slide and said, yeah, he's saying we might need to be a buyer from the international market. So I think there's a huge amount of interest in sort of watching this space and seeing how that evolves. I think we've got perspectives from our entire panel now. I'm kidding. VK, well, I'm going to let... I wanted to see VK's response to that, but no. VK Dugal, we are delighted that you're here with us from the Asian Development Bank. And you obviously watch developments across the whole region. So you've got two options. You can like highlight a couple things that you think are really important, or you can tell us what Stefano got wrong. No, we won't do that. We won't put Stefano on the point. But I would love to get your insights about what your outlook is for the region right now and where some of the key issues and opportunities are.
Thanks, Dirk. And thanks for putting me on this panel with both the private sector and the governments are here. And that's what the Asian Development Bank is. We're supporting governments and also supporting climate action by the private sector, which is going to be very important in this fight against climate change. On the carbon markets, in my view, the most important thing for the countries in the region is that the policymakers need to appreciate that carbon markets are not going to operate in vacuum. Carbon markets are part of the broader climate carbon pricing landscape. And the carbon pricing itself is a part of the broader climate policy architecture. We have worked a lot with policymakers in the region. I'm very glad there's a growing momentum about it. There's a growing appreciation about it. But I think still some more work needs to be done. We are in Paris era now, which is a bit different from Kyoto. And therefore, countries need to look at the carbon markets in the context of their climate ambition, their NDCs, and where they would like to go and how would they like to use different carbon market instruments in achieving their targets. That's one bit from our perspective. The second bit is countries will need to get their head around how to use carbon markets. Stefano made a great presentation about the domestic ETS, but again, that's again one part. Countries will have to see domestic markets, bilateral markets like JCM, or the international markets under Article 6, and how to make their carbon market strategies, what to do with what instrument, and where to put their priorities, which instrument they would like to use in their national context. I think national context is going to be very, very important now. The third thing is, from my perspective, is the Asia and the Pacific was the hub of international carbon markets under Kyoto. And I'm still convinced that Asia and Pacific is going to be very important for carbon markets coming under Article 6. But at the same time, countries would need to build on the expertise that they have gained under the Kyoto time, whether it is on the infrastructure or the institutions or even the methodologies and so on and so forth. But even though we have done a lot of carbon markets work in this region, we are in the transitionary phase to the Paris and Article 6. So there is a huge capacity deficit. And as a development institution, we are working very closely with the development partners and also with other governments and the private sector, how to bring everybody around and help them to build their policy framework, their institutional infrastructure, and very importantly, how to help countries and also the private sector to come about certain pilots, because the need of the hour is to build certain pilots and how we can draw lessons from the pilots and feed those lessons into the development, the policy development, and also the infrastructure building. So these are some of the bits that we are working. From our perspective, Article 6 support facility that we established in 2018 is going full stream. We are working with some of the governments. Party has been very kind to mention that. Some of the other governments that we are working, supporting them in the policy development support, infrastructure, pilots. But we have also established a new carbon fund under Article 6, which will become operative. We'll start buying credits once again. One of the comments that came from Benedict was very important about the sustainable development impacts. ADB, whenever we have bought credits, we have put high emphasis on the sustainable development impacts of the projects, the mitigation actions. That's what we did under our carbon funds, under the Kyoto, the Future Carbon Fund. We are keeping a very close tab on the projects that we are supporting under the Japan Fund for Joint Crediting Mechanism, under which we are supporting certain mitigation actions which are implementing advanced low carbon technologies. And going forward, a close watch on the sustainable development impacts under our new carbon fund, the Climate Action Catalyst Fund, which also going to be one of the pillars. So we are very convinced that the prices for the carbon assets should be determined keeping in consideration of the SD impacts. That's very important. This is something we'll take forward. Thanks.
Thanks, VK. In thinking about the sort of the regional prospects and that leadership role, that you're absolutely right. This region played such an important role in the formation of the Kyoto markets, right? We had a session not unlike this in Rio a few weeks ago, and there was just as much enthusiasm there that LATAM might be the region that is more ready to go. If we're thinking ahead here about who's going to come online with new systems, because I really think a lot of that is, there's a capacity building element, but a lot of it is in the governmental framework and governments deciding what do they want to do and how do they want to channel the investment. All right, so my question for you and a follow-up is, which are the ones to watch? You don't have to pick one because obviously Dita's sitting right next to you, so you can pick three. What are the top three countries in this region that'll be the trendsetters that we should watch next year, in the coming year?
In the interest of time, I'll be very precise. Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand.
Singapore didn't make the list. Ben?
I'm talking of the developing member countries on the selling side.
They were exempt. They were exempt as hosts. But Ben, how would you answer that question? Because I know you were also involved in your own diplomacy on this, but also in terms of encouraging peers in other countries to sort of step up the action, and we're getting ready for a global stock take next year, so really the pressure is on for countries. Where do you see sort of some of the breakthrough potential in the coming year?
Thanks so much, Dirk. So I think the breakthrough potential is actually getting Article 6 projects off the ground, implemented and demonstrating very clearly to everyone around the world that actually this is a legitimate way of meeting compliance targets. It results in concrete, mutually beneficial gains that are shared across both parties itself. I thought some of the key pieces which is needed, and which I think alludes to the point that you made earlier, is the institutional framework and structures to be able to support the implementation of some of these projects. And I would agree with you that the LATAM countries are probably quite far ahead because they have thought about this for quite a while. They also have a fairly good idea of what are its activities that are within NDC, within the conditional space, the unconditional space, and above NDC itself. In fact, we have seen LATAM countries that have even went out to publish their marginal abatement cost curve, which then lays out very clearly in an extremely transparent way which are the activities that are suitable for Article 6 pilots and projects itself. So I thought that's one key area that I would say it's a critical ingredient that is necessary before we can get some of these projects happening. The other is, I would say, things like technology, financing, and local community and stakeholder support. And I think once you are fairly clear what are the activities you want to do, you line up the financing, you line up the technology as well as the expertise itself, you get the local stakeholders and community involved as far as possible, I think you have the right players that are needed to actually bring this forward. And I do agree with VK. I mean, within Southeast Asia, those are the countries which I think are probably at the forefront. Latin America has a lot of promising activities. The other region I actually wanted to highlight is Africa. I think within the Africa continent, there are a few African countries that are also very established. The last area, and this one I really need to make a pitch for, is since Singapore is part of the AOSIS, the Alliance for Small Island States itself, I think there are also fairly good opportunities within AOSIS. And the good thing about AOSIS is that because you're looking at smaller island states, things happen at a smaller scale, but being at a smaller scale, it means the route to implementation could actually be potentially fairly fast itself. And one example I can give is that at the recent COP, Singapore signed an MOU with Papua New Guinea. It's the first AOSIS country that we signed an Article 6 MOU. But we first spoke to them only at Bonn this year. So within a very short period of 6 months, we managed to conclude and to be able to advance the MOUs. And I think this is quite testament to the fact that if you look at smaller countries, the scale, the complexity is probably a lot less. You can see it as a petri dish, where you can easily innovate, implement activities, and therefore generate fairly quick results itself. So to me, I think those are important ingredients, those are important regions that we should take a very close look at and work very closely with them to actually bring about some of these concrete projects. Thanks.
That's a really interesting point, because part of, I think, where we are is needing more examples to replicate, right? And so one of those is there aren't many places on the planet right now where you actually know how the process is going to work to get an authorization for a transfer and that commitment for corresponding adjustment. So if we can get some concrete models for that with smaller jurisdictions that may be a bit more nimble, maybe that's something we can build on. Stefano, I'm going to come to you just for a second, because I feel like I should allow you to answer this question too, of the ones to watch in the coming year. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, and I'll really just build on what VK and Ben already said. I think, more like, rather than 3 countries to watch, I would look at 3 main areas. I mean, one will be like really what VK said. So how things will shake out in Indonesia and Vietnam, as 2 countries with relatively large emissions that are coming up with a configuration for their domestic carbon pricing policy, and that it will end up being an interesting mix of an ETS, of a carbon tax, but also with crediting elements, both potentially for compliance, but also for voluntary purposes. So I think it will be an interesting space to watch. The second one will be the consolidation of existing carbon pricing instruments, and the big one to watch will be how China progresses its ETS, how it will expand it to different sectors, how it will move to an absolute cap that will decline over time, and the way that it will interact with international markets, as Hendrik also pointed out. Third space to watch is really what will come out from Singapore, especially in the context of, the bilateral deals that got signed, but also in the context of the CAD trust that you guys, the government of Singapore and the World Bank will launch. Because again, that can be quite instrumental in getting an international market for both government and the private sector up and running in the near future, hopefully.
Great. Thanks, Stefano. That was that's good to get those perspectives, and a nice way of dodging the question so you don't have to pick favorites. Wei-Mi, do you have, again, from your kind of regional perspective, particular jurisdictions that you see that are poised to move, or maybe it's like even in the sense that Ben was talking about in smaller increments of just like piloting and that kind of thing?
Well, I think in terms of countries to watch, also because I'm based in Singapore, I think we have very major sources of potential correspondingly adjusted carbon credits. I mean, we've mentioned Thailand, Indonesia, all the countries that Singapore has MOUs with. But aside from that, I think what's also really important is also the regulatory and legal framework around carbon credits and their status. So I think Singapore has also recently done something like they have actually exempt the carbon credits and the trading of carbon credits from GST. I think that's a significant development and very helpful to helping trading scale up within the region. And that's something we hope to see replicated, hopefully, within the region as well. So we're looking to understand how the regulatory frameworks are going to be set up in the region. So how are, for example, Indonesia going to administer carbon credits? They have recently signed into law, I believe, the proportions of carbon credits which should remain within Indonesia, certain proportions which may be admissible with corresponding adjustments to the international markets. So all these frameworks actually need to be developed across the region. And Singapore has taken several first steps. Indonesia has taken first steps. And then Thailand itself actually already has a domestic emissions trading scheme. So actually the region is, I think, quite well poised in the carbon markets. And we're just looking to see what are the legal and regulatory frameworks that are going to come out, I think, in the coming months and years.
Thank you. Dita, I want to give you an opportunity to sort of defend Indonesia's honor. No, I want to give you a chance to maybe add a little color on how you're thinking about the international engagement piece. Obviously, you're a key player in the international arena, particularly in nature-based solutions. You've got amazing assets in that space, but understandably a priority on ensuring that you'll be able to meet your own NDCs, but you also have this opportunity where you may be able to lean into the international market to attract the investment to accelerate it all. How are you thinking about that, about sort of building out your Article 6 engagement?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you mentioning Indonesia. Yeah, we already exercising Article 6, not only with ADB, but with Singapore and also with GGI, with Norway and some other countries. Also, we experience JCM. This is a kind of a bilateral together government and private sector. So I think, yeah, and we are already recognized Article 6.2, 6.4 in our regulation. So, yeah, we are preparing the institutional, the modalities, more technical level this year up to the early next years, and hopefully by the mid of next years we can implement it. We will encourage also the private sectors to involve in all these carbon pricing. And we have planned also to attract more international stakeholders, particularly the private sectors, to engage with Indonesia.
Great, thank you. Hendrik, I'm going to give you a chance at this sort of question about what's a particular place to watch, and then I'm going to open to the audience for some questions or comments. So, Hendrik.
Yeah, no, I sort of want to flip it around a little bit more from a buyer perspective. So for us, we are generators, we can issue credits, but we also, on the flip side, have set ourselves net zero targets. We have a decarbonization pathway. We reduce our Scope 1 emissions by switching to renewables, and that enables everyone else to reduce their Scope 2 emissions, our customers. So that's the easy one, and I think what I alluded to earlier in terms of certificates being one particular tool to get to that, and that's, the integrity that comes with that is really relatively straightforward. It just requires more investment in order to make that happen. But the challenge really is when it comes to our Scope 3 profile and the net zero standards that are coming through, and how are we expected as a corporate to get to 2050 or whatever your net zero target is, and to offset all the way along that line credibly. I think we're still at a point now where there's question marks being raised. If I go to the board and say we need to spend so many millions of dollars to achieve our net zero targets by buying credits, there will be questions about what are we buying, right? And then there's, we get media inquiries. We have a program in Australia where we we offer to customers zero carbon electricity on the basis of purchasing credits. Media comes to us, what kind of credits are those? Aren't those junk credits? Well, no, they're not. There's all these different pieces of the puzzle that are part of that. So I think we really still need to work on the integrity piece. That is something anywhere in all markets, but in particular for a corporate, in order to really utilize carbon credits as a tool, we need to take this a step further. And I think the big piece that's coming today, the Climate Action Data Trust, I think is really a piece that could move the market in that space, where we can literally tap onto a third-party, independent, no vested interest source of information and check this credit. What are we buying? Are we really investing in a credible climate change mitigation outcome?
And that's an advertisement for the last session of the day.
It's the reality.
No. Yeah, it is the reality, but it's also the announcement that's coming later today that will have a reception associated with it, so nobody's going to want to miss that. But thanks, Hendrik, because I do think you stitched together a couple of things there. The Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, which we're also deeply engaged in as IETA, it's trying to do its piece too about setting a threshold of integrity, which again is something that can then be reflected in the data trust as a sort of a prime label. So more to come on that space, not at this event because we're still working on it, but coming soon to a carbon market newsletter near you. I would like to draw the audience in, and I actually don't know. Good, we have a microphone coming. We're going to start with Takashi Hango here on the front row, and then come over to Peru over here. And I'm not going to know everybody's name in the room, but the first two I apparently know. Please, Takashi.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question on carbon price in Indonesia. Vicky and Stefano mentioned that they are one of the interesting countries. But I understand as the first sector to receive a carbon pricing in Indonesia is likely to be electricity sector. And the electricity sector in Indonesia, that is a regulated market. So what do you think about the cost of carbon on electricity prices? So it's a price transfer mechanism on the electricity sector. That is my question.
Thanks, Takashi. Dita, do you want to take that one? And maybe then bring the microphone over. Raise your hand. Okay, great.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. Yeah, 70% power sector is run by state-owned enterprise. We already have running the pilot in power sectors a year ago, and it's quite running well. That's why we adopt the pilot scheme into the regulation. So we just 1 year, and the next after we will we implement it in the regulations. About the price, our law, our regulation mentioned the floor price, and hopefully within the several years, and the market already matures, the price will goes up. That's why we put cap and trade and tax. So hopefully tax can, if the tax is going higher, so the market will be more established. And we will also use exchange for domestic carbon market. So hopefully because this is a market, so we will depend on the market about the price. And if the international price is very good, so we'll stimulate also the price in Indonesia.
Great, thank you for that. Peru, and do you mind introducing yourself to the group?
Thank you. Myself, Perumal, manager for intergovernmental negotiations from the UN Climate Change Secretariat, dealing with Article 6. I have, I hope Ben doesn't take it otherwise. I just wanted to have a couple of questions to Ben to understand, and I think that Singapore has always set standards in terms of what to be done, and it's great to know you are in contact with 30 other countries. And also, one of the most encouraging part was make it or a break it deal for Article 6 in Madrid COP was related to adaptation finance, of how Article 6.2 is contributing to adaptation finance. And I'm very happy to hear that all your contracts are coming up with that contribution. My second question, you coming from AOSIS, which is a bit political thing, is to know, is your contracts are also looking at the overall mitigation of global emissions? Are you looking in your contracts also to look at the OMG contribution from 6.2? This is also, again, a voluntary call in the decisions in Glasgow. The second one, which has a bit of a cross question to both you and Hendrik, in terms of, yes, like my favorite words of the carbon market integrity is that how you have to have a SWIFT code for your financial transactions. For carbon transactions as well, you need to have a SWIFT code, which is the supplementarity, integrity, fungibility, and transparency. So how, in both of your cases, because most of your cooperation, as much as I know, are baseline and crediting mechanism types, not necessarily an ETS linking or an ETS systems. So my question to both of you, if integrity is the fundamental point that you are looking at, once if Article 6.4 is operational completely, would you like to use that as the regulatory system to be used rather than replicating the baseline and crediting mechanism at all your, because I know that there are contracts that have been signed, which basically says that once these systems are running, that you use the 6.4 mechanism to issue the credit so that you don't replicate, because once you have multiple things going on, you also have a bias in terms of what you deliver and ensure an integrity. Like I think morning Minister Fu was also talking about convergence against standards. So my question to both of you is that when you talk about integrity, are you also thinking of using systems that have been put together by multilateral process to be used, and then you have a 6.2 cooperation, but using the infrastructure that is established around 6.4. And then for Hendrik, an additional question is in terms of Chinese example, like I was quite interested to know of your take, because as you know that the Chinese NDC covers only CO2 based emissions. The 5% of their ETS coverage, despite it is only for power sector, the demand is going to be 0.24 gigatons. Because it's the 4.8 gigatons is the emissions of China's coverage in the ETS. Since their NDC is only CO2 based, I'm hearing two sets of voices from China, so I do not know, I don't directly deal with markets. So are they looking at sectors other than CO2 based emissions, remaining 6 GHG gases that would be emanating in their installations, like the HFCs, the N2Os, the NF3s, the nitrogen trifluoride, methane, etc., as a source of reductions to be used within the power sector to meet the demand, or are they looking really for international carbon markets outside of China? So that is, if you have any information, I would be happy to know that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Purma, for the question. So your first question is on the OMGE, the overall reduction in global emissions itself. So yes, apart from the 5%, we are also planning to do the 2% as well. And for us, this is really walking the talk, because I think for those of you who recall, as part of Singapore trying to help facilitate the process of landing Article 6 at Glasgow, one of the last few outstanding issues which was threatening to unravel Article 6 on the very last night was this thing about OMG, what's the percentage share itself. And I think we stepped in at the technical level to try to forge an outcome that was acceptable to most of the key parties around the table. And for us, this is really walking the talk. I mean, we played a role in trying to bridge the differences. And now when it comes to implementation, it's really to demonstrate that whatever that we were pushing, we would actually do itself. And I think that consistency is important in order to generate trust within the market itself. I think your next question is something that we probably take a more open view on. So I think what's important is that Singapore supports the various approaches that is under Article 6, 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8 as well. And for the market-based approaches, specifically 6.4, 6.2, and 6.4, we support the principle that there should be consistency across both. If not, you may get the case of, in a sense, for want of a better word, regulatory leakage, whereby things just get channeled towards the mechanism that has more lax rules and that allows greater scope for you to credit per se. So I think we support both. We support consistency. As to whether that actually means that there needs to be overall centralization of mechanism itself, as in both 6.2 and 6.4 eventually rely on, say, example, the same registry. I think we take a slightly more open view to that. And in part because both mechanisms are still evolving. And what is more important is the overall outcome that we are trying to achieve, which is to advance and to accelerate global climate action. And I think whatever approaches that serves the outcome, be it a more decentralized approach whereby you have multiple registries or one in which where there's greater centralization, I think at this point in time, at least from my point of view, I think it's a little bit too early to say. It's really the outcome that we are more driving towards. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Ben. Hendrik, do you want to pick up that last part?
Not sure, actually. It's the question itself sort of perhaps speaks for itself in the sense that the complexity of what you're asking, I don't have an answer to, which to some extent also perhaps speaks to the carbon markets and where we're at and some of the pieces that we still need to put together. We need to be much more direct and clear in terms of what is being bought and sold. Without all these, I mean, the detail I appreciate, we can take some of this offline, and I can explore if I have answers for this, but I don't off the cuff have an answer for you. In terms of the China ETS as well, I think we'll have to see. This is under development. It's much too soon to speak clearly on that particular piece.
Thanks, Hendrik. And I will say, I think in terms of what was said in the presentation in Sharm el-Sheikh, it was about use of 6.2 and 6.4, and that was about it. It just said we may look to buy through those mechanisms. So it wasn't touching on the other sectors in China. It was looking abroad, which was pretty novel. Okay, guess what? We're at the end of time according to this big clock here, and I don't know if you can hear the coffee break next door, but apparently there are a lot of people that are already ahead of you in line for the coffee. But I really appreciate everyone for sticking with us and for our panelists for an amazing conversation. Stefano, thanks for the overview, and panelists, all of you, thank you for your contributions. Join me in giving them a round of applause. And you are dismissed to have some coffee.